Hello, everybody. This is Jimmy. Welcome to another episode of the Jimmy Tingle Show. I'm very excited today to introduce my friend, and he just came out with a new book that is just fantastic. I want to read a little bit of his bio for you. John Taylor Ike Williams, a founder of Kneerim Williams Literary Agency, specializes in biography, history, politics, natural science, and anthropology. He is a member of the NEA Literary Panel, chair of the Boston Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, co-chair of the Fine Arts Work Center, a member of the advisory board of the Biography Conference, and he is a former director of the Boston Book Festival. As a lawyer, Ike specializes in intellectual property. That's where I come in, ladies and gentlemen, the intellectual property and First Amendment litigation as well as a comic, particularly in publishing, film, television, and news and new media. Ike is the author of The Shores of Bohemia, a Cape Cod story, 1910 to 1960, a rousing account of the artists and political revolutionaries who made the Cape a hub of American culture in the early 20th century. I just want to read one review to start off. This is from Drew Faust, author of The Republic of Suffering, Death in the American Civil War. Drew writes, a cornucopia of characters whose lives in the first half of the 20th century made the outer reaches of Cape Cod a site of exuberant artistic creativity and social and political experimentation. The bohemian world Ike Williams depicts will fascinate readers interested in the winds and tides of modern American culture, as well as those of us today who walk the Cape's beaches and swim in its waters. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show, the one and the only Mr. Ike Williams. How are you, Ike?
Hello, Jimmy.
Good to
How are
see you
you?
again.
Nice to see you again.
Yes. I went to your reading the other night at the Harvard bookstore. It was great. It was great to be in the same room with you and so many other people who have read the book and just got the book recently. And it's just fun to see you in action, talking about this labor of love that you've been working on for a while. Number one, how long have you been working on this book? And number two, what made you want to write this book?
Too long is the answer of how long. Having had two jobs, running a literary agency and a law firm, there wasn't a lot of side time. 3 boys. It's dedicated to my wife. I think you knew Noah, Jimmy.
Yes.
Noah Hall, and
Yes.
And of course, I didn't start out dedicating it to her because we worked a bit on it together. But and after her death, I sort of stopped for a while, and then I regained my speed. And so it came out May 17th from Farrar Straus, and I was damn glad to finish it.
That's great. Well, it's a real masterpiece. Just captures a time in history from 1910 to 1960, primarily focusing on Provincetown, Wellfleet, and Truro, and the cast of characters that showed up there on those shores from that time period. What made you want to, focus on that cast of characters in that time period?
I didn't know that part of the world at all. I'm a Gloucester kid. I think I'd been over the canal once in my lifetime before I went a courting my wife in Wellfleet. Her dad was a painter and architect of note, and pretty bohemian individual. And through my wife and her family, I was introduced to a lot of the people that are in this book who were just beginning to vanish off the scene. And they so fascinated me that I thought, I don't think anybody's ever written a group portrait of this incredible 2 generations of very political activists, intellectual, artistic people who just came to this very small place. I mean, in 1910, the only 2 ways you could get to Provincetown were by the day boat from Boston in good weather or the fish boat from New York. It landed in Fall River, and then you could take the train into Provincetown. There was no highway then. The roads were all sand, even if you had a car. So it was a very remote place, and it remained remote almost right through 1960, because the book ends in 1960, because not only does this political period end in 1960, as far as I'm concerned, with the end of liberalism and the 2 defeats of Adlai Stevenson in the Democratic primaries, but also the creation of the National Seashore, which in some senses was great because it preserved part of the Lower Cape's both sides of the actual beach part, but they'd run out of money, so they only got up as far as Dennis. I mean, the objective was to go all the way to the canal, and it turned it into America's playground. And so every piece of unbuilt land was built on. So it's a much different looking place than it was during that 50-year period. So it's about a group of people that inhabited that very different place for 50 years. But I was just so fascinated by them, whether they were architects or political activists or writers or designers, painters. It was just a great pleasure to know them all. And many of them I represented either as a lawyer or as a literary agent as time went by. But I realized there were all kinds of biographies of Mary McCarthy or Edmund Wilson or John Dos Passos or John Reed. There wasn't a group portrait of these people and what motivated this kind of culture they had during this period. And I thought, I'll take a whack at it. And that's what you got.
Yeah, well, you did a fascinating job. And what I found really interesting is that most of them migrated up from Greenwich Village in New York in the early 1900s, starting around 1910. And they were living in the village. It must have been a great respite to go from New York, Greenwich Village in 1900, probably a pretty gritty place, to the wilds of Cape Cod, the outer Cape, particularly at a time when it wasn't very, very developed at all.
All three were fishing communities. I mean, they'd started as whaling communities, then they'd moved to cod, and as the cod moved north to herring, and now that they were fished out, basically. So there were lots of empty fish piers and fish shacks, and a lot of people were out of work. The land had been stripped, both for timber and for early farming, because it settled in the 17th century, very little topsoil. So it's a hard way to make a living if there is fishing. So there was a lot of empty housing and cheap land for sale in 1910. And in the village in 1910, Bohemia was beginning to attract tourists already into the village. Now, you couldn't call yourself a Bohemian if you lived above 15th Street. So you lived right in those streets that radiate around Washington Square from the Stanford White big arch there at the end of the avenue. And they were all in little tiny streets, embedded with this huge immigrant population of Italian, Irish, and Jews that had come during the Civil War period for Irish and Italians shortly thereafter, and then enormous amounts of Jews during the pogroms just before the 1900s in Tsarist Russia. So it was an enormous sort of hotbed of reform, people trying to reform both politics and the working conditions of labor. And remember, in those days, if you were a worker, you worked a 6-day week, 10 hours a day, that man, woman, and child. So, I mean, it was a very tough position for workers who were suddenly working in these enormous mines, textile mills that hadn't existed before the Civil War. So there's a lot of uprising about this condition of the American lower sort of classes and economic classes. So it's a really vibrant period, and it draws all these young people to work in the village in journalism or in reform, working in settlement houses or teaching in the public school systems in New York, which were really how all these immigrants made their acclimatization into American culture, was all through the great public school system. So it was a vibrant period, but it was very expensive even then to live in New York. And when they began to discover Provincetown, they found that it was really cheap housing to be had. It was really, they were led by a woman who was both active in the world of Greenwich Village, built around the Masses magazine, which was the magazine of the left, of the progressive and socialists, which all of these people belonged to those two parties. And Mary Heaton Vorse, actually, she was born up in the Berkshires. Her family owned the Red Lion Inn, Stockbridge. And she'd been to Europe as a young girl, spoke 4 languages, very sophisticated. But for whatever reason, she'd fallen into the American labor movement in the progressive and socialists. And she had become an expert on both European labor movements and the American labor movement. Remember, we're starting with the International Women's Garment Workers Union and the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World, and the AFL-CIO. This is a big period of union organizing. She was very active in it. And she recruited all these friends of hers who also contributed to the Masses to come and stay and rent or buy in Provincetown from 1900 on. Charles Hawthorne had also opened his famous School of Painting just 4 years before 1910 and beginning to attract the very best young painters in America. So it suddenly became a place where all the sort of political activists, writers, and painters were finding a home, and a cheap home. Floyd Dell, who was the editor of the Masses, at one point referred to Provincetown as Greenwich Village sunburned. So, so that's sort of the setting.
So I have to tell you, I've been going down to the Cape for years, and I would guess that most people in Massachusetts or New England, or the country for that matter, don't really know about the early history of the Cape, especially the Outer Cape, with that intellectual dimension. Now, when these folks were coming down there, were they coming just down for the summer as a way to, relax and have fun and just explore creativity and party? Because I know there's a lot of partying that's going on in your book. There's a lot of partying and there's a lot of shenanigans going on in this book. But was that part of the motivation, just to get out of town?
But we could set the table about the Bohemians. Remember, this was a period where all of these young people were breaking away from the Victorian mores. Mm-hmm. The women didn't want to be just someone who raised children, and the husband led a career and a social life, and they stayed at home with the kids. These young women wanted the same life as men. They were called the New Women, and they rallied around all of the women who were seeking to vote for women. Remember, women had no vote until 1929. So for 19 years, they have no vote. So they're very active in suffrage. Margaret Sanger, who summers every summer in Provincetown, had created birth control. And that, of course, was controversial. But for women, it was an enormous feeling of that maybe they didn't have to have a child every time they became pregnant. Mm-hmm. They also felt that they should have the same sort of romantic life, whether they were affairs before marriage or even affairs after marriage, as the men were having. Mm-hmm. So it was a radical period for men and women, both sexually and romantically. Marriages didn't last a long time often. They weren't particularly great parents. They were really focused on their careers and politics. Mm-hmm. And the kids had to sort of thrive on their own. But many of these people had thrived on their own anyway, like Emma Goldman, who'd come as a young girl out of the Lithuanian Pale, and went to work in a textile factory in New York when she was 16. A lot of them were immigrants. Big Bill Haywood, one of the founders of the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World, had gone into the mines at 12. His dad had been a Pony Express writer. And a lot of them had come from fancy universities, mm-hmm. Harvard and Princeton, and lots of them from the Middle West, too. So they all met in Greenwich Village. They found one, of course, once they could get there, living was cheap. It was beautiful weather in the summer. And many of them then stayed on to paint or to write, found it easier to, and began to realize they could, if they had any success at all, buildings were incredibly cheap. You could buy a woodlot in Truro or Wellfleet for, $50, $100. It may not have a road remember, none of these houses had heat or sewage anyway, right. Before the 30s. So it was cheap to live there. And most people found if they were on a creative jag, they'd stay there until they finished their book. You mentioned Norman Mailer. Norman loved to write in Provincetown. He just found it the place that seemed to call out to him.
How did some of these literary giants end up there? For example, Eugene O'Neill. How does Eugene O'Neill end up in Provincetown? And what time was that?
He comes down in 1916 on the day boat, the Dorothy Bradford from Boston, with an old Irish Revolutionary alcoholic who'd been a deckhand with him on tramp steamers. O'Neill had dropped out of Princeton, already a heavy drinker, the son of a famous sort of actor of that period, James O'Neill, of which he wrote many of his plays about his father and mother and brother. And then he was a deckhand. But this particular summer, he'd gone to study with George Baker, had a playwriting class at Harvard that was famous. And he had a bunch of plays he'd written. And his Irish friend said to one of the couples who had started a theater down there, from plays they were already performing in New York and Greenwich Village, they decided to create a little theater company called the Provincetown Players, just on the front porch of the house. And O'Neill was introduced by his shipmate. He said, this guy has a bunch of plays. And so they said, well, why don't you read us one? And O'Neill was so shy that he had to have someone else read it. It was the first play of this Glen Cairn cycle that made O'Neill's career, all performed at the Provincetown Players, but about the life of these deckhands on this tramp steamer, the Glen Cairn. So and he just finds Provincetown perfect for him. He's an alcoholic, but he's an interesting alcoholic. O'Neill would never write while he drank. He said, nothing I've ever written while I drank is any good. So he would go sober when he wrote all his plays. I mean, he won we won the Nobel Prize for playwriting in 1922. I mean, but the next year he was hopelessly drunken. I mean, that's what his life was until late in his life in the 40s. But he found Provincetown, just as Tennessee Williams did, another alcoholic. But for some reason, Provincetown worked for them. They could stop drinking when they wanted to really create. Williams's best plays are all written in Provincetown. Many of the painters who were heavy drinkers found Provincetown. Alcohol was considered a muse for Bohemians. I mean, it was just part of their life. They viewed drinking as, part of the sort of Athenian way of finding the muse and joy in their lives. And obviously it led to a lot of damage too. But as you said, it led to a lot of partying too. Anyway, and a lot of creativity.
So they would go there, Tennessee Williams, Eugene O'Neill, Norman Mailer. When does he show up there, and what works does he turn out while he was there?
Mailer is at Harvard, and he has a girlfriend at BU, and she brings him down to Provincetown. He's never been there. He's a New Jersey kid, and he finds it fascinating, and he starts a novel there. He'd been working in a mental hospital in Waltham while he was at Harvard. And the title of the book he was writing about his time in this mental hospital was The Naked and the Dead.
Wow.
And then the minute he's out of Harvard, he's drafted. And he writes all these letters to her from the Philippines, where he's serving, about the war. And that becomes The Naked and the Dead, which he finishes in Provincetown, keeping the title of his first book. And after that, almost every book he writes is predominantly written in Provincetown.
So
And,
was he coming down just for the summers, or was he living there year round?
He'd live there whenever he was writing. I mean, he lived in Brooklyn, always had a house in Brooklyn. He loved Brooklyn and he loved Provincetown, and he bounced back and forth. If the muse was singing to him in Brooklyn, he'd write in Brooklyn. Remember, he was a co-owner of the Village Voice for a while, and remember he ran for mayor in New York with Jimmy Breslin. They ran in a ticket together. So he spent time in. All of these people are really active in radical politics, whether it's Henry Wallace, the Communist Party, the Progressive, the Socialist, Liberal parties. So you have to be in New York for much of that work,
right,
whether it's union work or just activist work. So they're back and forth all the time. But it's no longer just a summer place. It's a creative place. I mean, Hans Hofmann, who ran the great painting school that created abstract expressionism in America, spent 8 months a year there. And then he had a school in New York for 4 months. But he spent 8 months there from May to October every year.
Right.
So it became a place where if you got in gear and what you were creating, you just stayed.
Tell me about the Provincetown Players, because that's just a legendary story in the world of theater. It was a theater on a pier, right? Is that right? On a wharf in Provincetown, and Eugene O'Neill and others produced some of their earliest and most successful works there?
Right, and that pier isn't there anymore, but I mentioned Mary Heaton Vorse, who started inviting all these people to join her in Provincetown, the labor activist and writer. Mary's house was opposite a pier which she owned, on the other side of the street, jutting out into the harbor. And at the end of it was a large fish house, which she'd given to a friend's wife who was a painter. And I told you about these people who were beginning to perform plays at the Liberal Club in New York. and then bring them down to New York. And these were people like John Reed and Louise Bryan, and all these people were also writing. Dorothy Day was an actress in them. I mean, all these people that the St. Vincent Ballet were acting in New York and then coming down and acting again in these plays in the summer. Many of them written by these people like Susan Glaspell and Jig Cook, who were the mainstays of organizing this theater. So they were all writing and acting in it. And then this moment when his play is read and they say, this is what we're looking for. We want an American theme in our plays. We don't want to be mimicking Europe. All of these people are trying to create a new American voice in painting and in writing and in everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so they see O'Neill as, he concentrates on average people, farmers, working men, sailors, and that's what they all want to ground their work in. So that theater then moves to New York. The pier goes down in a hurricane, but the playhouse moves to New York to Greenwich Village. It moves 3 times. It probably really closes its doors about 1940 in New York. But O'Neill continues to write plays for it in New York as well. And Jig Cook and Susan Glaspell, who'd organized the theater, moved to New York to organize it again. And there it becomes a major place. I mean, that's where Paul Robeson plays in All God's Children. And nobody'd seen a black actor in a romantic situation with a white woman. The Ku Klux Klan threatened to blow up the theater. Thousands of Ku Klux Klanners came in. The mayor of New York tried to close it down. So it was a very controversial theater. It was putting on things about America that Americans hadn't seen before.
Do you think, Ike, that that whole early movement of the early 1900s up through the 1960 lend itself to the modern women's movement, gay rights movement, civil rights movement, political activism? It seems like a lot of the roots that we find today in our culture started there. Is that correct?
I really, that's what attracted me to the idea of a group portrait of these people, because, I mean, the thing about Bohemia is it's totally tolerant. There's no interest in your ethnicity, your race, or your class. It's just, what do you got, as Robert Minsky used to say. I mean, what can you offer me? Creativity. And if there was romantic potential, that was good too. But it was about what kind of creativity have you got? And Jew, Christian, Catholic, man, woman, gay, straight, it really didn't make any difference. Mm-hmm. Remember, it's also set in probably the most tolerant places in America, which are seaports. Provincetown was a naval base in both the First World War and the Second War. And towns with navies tend to be tolerant, right. Naval bases. So there was lots of drinking and sex. It wasn't. These fishermen had seen it all. Portuguese and Yankees. Right. So it was a place where people felt safe. Women felt safe to be independent. Lots of homosexuals came there earlier, long before we think of Provincetown as a gay summer place. It was a very gay, creative place. I mean, obviously Tennessee Williams, but you can go on and on. Many of the painters and writers came there because it was a very tolerant place for them. Mm-hmm. And that's early on, and we're talking the 20s and 30s.
And the locals, Ike, what was their reaction to this influx of New Yorkers and socialists and, gay folks and women's liberation folks? How were the Portuguese fishermen reacting, and the Yankees, how were they reacting?
Well, the Portuguese fishermen were a pretty full-blooded lot. I mean, if they were pretty girls who wanted to really go out with the real fishermen, there was plenty of action in the bars and stuff. The Portuguese wives were, of course, a much more conservative lot, deeply Catholic, many of them born on the mainland or in the Verdes and on the off islands. Oddly enough, they were the first to realize, when we're talking about the gay community, that there was money to be made because the Yankees were not very interested in renting their places or having them in their hotels, whereas the Portuguese began boarding houses in the 20s and 30s, and then created all the good nightclubs, the Atlantic House, Eartha Kitt and Lena Horne. All of these great singers came down, but this was a club basically for a gay and straight mixed clientele. And there were lots of clubs along Commercial Street, almost all owned by Portuguese. I mean, if you read even the papers, you almost never see any fights about someone's sexuality or attacks on women. It was a really safe place. I'm not saying that they didn't, cock a snook at some of these Bohemians. Of course they did. I mean,
Right.
These were deeply Catholic, traditional Portuguese fishermen. On the other hand, they all drank, and it became the center of rum running. And because of the Bohemians, there was a very good market for all the booze that these Portuguese and Yankee rum runners could bring into Provincetown Harbor. So there was a lot of back and forth between the groups.
That's good. So they lived in harmony, is what you're saying. They lived in harmony, even though the rest of the country hadn't caught up to this potentially harmonious relationship.
Oh yeah, the Portuguese and the Yankees didn't live in so much harmony. The Portuguese live in the West End, still do in Provincetown, and the Wasps and Yankees lived in the East End, even though they were all fishermen. So there was plenty of territorial stuff. But as far as the Bohemians went, as long as they were good customers and they provided pretty women for the town, I think they were very welcome. Yeah.
So, Ike, when did you start coming down to the Lower Cape on a regular basis?
Well, I came down just as the period that I write about ended, 1960. I came down courting my wife, who was a painter, in 1967. And 2 years later, we bought an old house in Wellfleet. It was the house where Mary McCarthy moved to with her new husband after she left Edmund Wilson and wrote this kind of famous acid bath novel about all these bohemians in Wellfleet and Truro called A Charmed Life. And in the studio that was on the land next to the house, the Partisan Review, which was the magazine of the liberal period that championed the rights of workers and a much more fair allocation of wealth and resources, they moved to the sort of more liberal movement, and the Partisan Review was kind of their magazine of choice. And it was edited in that studio. Arthur Schlesinger, who had a summer house in Wellfleet, wrote The Age of Jackson there, which I think it won the Pulitzer Prize that year,
Yeah.
Biography of Andrew Jackson. So that I already was deep into it when I bought that place. And as I said, my father-in-law was a painter and architect, and he knew all of these Bauhaus architects who'd settled in Truro after they had to flee Germany in the 30s as Hitler closed the Bauhaus, and many of them were intermarried with Jews or were Jewish, like Kandinsky and Marcel Breuer. So they had to flee, and most of them ended up with summer houses in Wellfleet.
Mm-hmm.
And he was, as an architect, very close to them. As a painter, he was very close to all the painters. And he was pretty far to the left. He had a farm on Boundbrook Island, and above his vegetable stand, it said, "No Trotskyites." And in those days in Wellfleet, in 1934, when Roosevelt becomes president, I can't find a Bohemian on the Lower Cape who voted for him. They were all either members of the Communist Party or socialists. In his next election in 38, they'd come around to him. They thought he was just a patrician in sheep's clothing and was just going to do the same old game of talking liberal but being conservative. But as they watched him deal with the Depression, they became enormous fans, but not for the first 4 years as they watched him deal with this incredible Depression, which was an enormous effect on all these people. And that's a mainstay of these people. I mean, they are true believers that America could be a much fairer place for men, women, blacks, Jews, everybody that they see being discriminated against during this 50-year period. They have really strong feelings about equality. They have really strong feelings about the misallocation of wealth. I mean, the idea that a worker is dismissed with no pension after years and a boss who runs a bad company is given a huge golden parachute. I mean, it just drove them crazy.
Yeah. And so that their values, their political values, were reflected in their works.
Even Norman Mailer, read the Barbary Shores. I mean, Norman, was a very big campaigner for Henry Wallace, who ran, after Roosevelt died. He ran against Truman for the Democratic primary, and he was much more to the left than Truman.
Still attracting the same type of people. It was still attracting the artistic people with a set of values who were using their work, whether it was as playwrights or writers or musicians or comics or whatever, to just reflect their values. I know you're going to be speaking at the Wellfleet Library soon, right?
It's the center of social life and intellectual life in Wellfleet. It's just the librarian just a few years ago won the Librarian of the Year award in the United States. I mean, it's that good a library.
Wow.
It's a great library.
Wow. So it's still a wonderful place. And of course, not to mention all the art galleries in Provincetown and all the performance spaces there and the WOMR radio station there that really does great avant-garde work. And they have, just a wonderful lineup of, they keep it local, but it's also universal in the sense of they're dealing with global issues all the time, politics, art, culture, whatever. And the same with Truro, with Kevin Rice at the Payamet Center for the Performing Arts in Truro.
And the Truro Center for the Arts Truro Center for the Arts and the Provincetown Art Association and Museum and the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown. I mean, those three institutions have been there. They were founded almost during this period. I mean, they were after 1960, but they were in the late 60s and early 70s. And they've really continued just what you're saying, Jimmy, about carrying on this place that makes it a comfortable place for young writers and painters to get a footing on. Jeff Zinn, as you mentioned, Howard's son, Jeff is the one who reads this book on the audio.
Oh, great. When is that going to come out?
No, it's out. You can get it from Blackstone Audio. Yeah.
Oh, great.
11 hours of Jeff reading it.
Oh, great. Well, I would prefer to listen and walk and listen to it. It's just easier than than sitting down and reading, for me anyway. But that's wonderful.
Great for car rides.
Yeah.
Anyway, Jeff does a brilliant job, and of course he grew up with all these people.
I'll tell you something about the Wellfleet audiences, and this goes for the Cape in general. In my experience, they are the best audiences. They are so good. They appreciate comedy. They appreciate theater. They appreciate good writing. They appreciate art. They're just wonderfully supportive people. Yes. When are you going to be at the library?
I'm at the library in August with Helena Kennedy. Have you ever heard her speak down there? She's a human rights lawyer based in England.
Now, Ike, if people want to find out where you're doing your book readings or things like at the Wellfleet Library, where would they find that schedule?
Let's see. The publisher has it, Farrar, Straus and Giroux. But
do you have a website?
They're free to email me at ike@shoresofbohemia.com, and I'm glad to.
Okay. We'll put that in. We'll put that in the show notes in this show. Ike at shoresofbohemia.com. Ike.
Yeah, just
IKE. Yep.
Yeah, and no break. Shoresofbohemia.com.
Shores of Bohemia, which is the name of the book. It's a fun read. I want to finish it. I might finish it listening to Jeff Zinn in my ear as I walk around the Charles River or maybe in Wellfleet. Right. But it's a fun read, and it brings back a time that a lot of people don't realize the real roots of the Outer Cape. And it's fascinating to find all these incredible people in one place, and that their work is still being carried on in the tradition of making the country a better country through whatever means people are able to do so. Again, congratulations on the book. It's a great read, and I encourage folks to go out and get it.
The Wellfleet General Market runs a really nice bookstore.
Yes.
Stephen Russell.
Yep.
Jimmy, it's been a privilege.
Yeah.
We've known each other a long time, but we've never done one of these.
No, we never have. So it's a lot of fun. By the way, that's where I got the book. It was 15% off down at
Right.
the Wellfleet General Market. Used to be Lima's. I still call it
That's
Lima's.
right.
And Stephen Russell sold it to me. He says, I said,
Yeah,
why is it 15% off? He goes, we do 15% off to all the new publications. I said, what a great deal. And that's another way
yeah,
that the town supports the arts. So Ike, thank you
yeah.
so much for joining us today.
Oh, yeah.
Congratulations, continued success, and I'll see you on the shores of Bohemia.
I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you for joining us today. This has been a Humor for Humanity production. Our mission is your mission. Humor for Humanity at jimmytingle.com. Thank you.